You're not angry at them. You're angry at yourself. A deep journey into self-betrayal, emotional healing, and inner freedom. The lie we tell ourselves. Most people believe their anger comes from other people. From betrayal. From rejection. From disrespect. From abandonment. They believe someone else entered their life, damaged them emotionally, and became the reason for their suffering. But that is only half the truth. Because if pain alone created suffering, every human being would break in the exact same way. Yet they do not. Some people survive heartbreak and become wiser. Others become bitter for years. Some people get rejected and move forward. Others replay one conversation in their mind for a decade. Some people get betrayed once and learn boundaries. Others spend their lives drowning in resentment. Why? Because the deepest pain is rarely created by what others did to us. It is created by what their actions revealed inside us. That is the truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You are not only angry at them. You are angry because you ignored your intuition. You abandoned your self-respect. You tolerated what you knew was wrong. You begged for love you should never have chased. You stayed silent when you should have walked away. You betrayed yourself long before anyone betrayed you. And that realization is unbearable. So instead of facing ourselves, we create villains. We obsess over what they said, what they did, who they chose, how they hurt us. Because blaming others feels safer than confronting the war happening inside our own mind. But anger is rarely pure anger. Sometimes it is humiliation. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is wounded pride. Sometimes it is the pain of realizing we built our identity around people who never truly valued us. And sometimes, anger is simply sadness wearing armor. This book is not about blaming yourself for everything that happened to you. Some people truly hurt you. Some people lied, manipulated, used, abandoned, destroyed trust you gave honestly. This book is not written to excuse toxic behavior. It is written to help you understand why certain experiences destroy you emotionally while others do not. Because every emotional reaction carries a hidden message. Your jealousy reveals insecurity. Your resentment reveals attachment. Your rage reveals wounded ego. Your desperation reveals fear of abandonment. Your inability to let go reveals emotional dependence. People often think healing means changing the outside world. Finding better people, better relationships, more respect, more validation. But real healing begins the moment you stop asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and start asking, "Why did this destroy me so deeply?" That question changes everything. Because the moment you become emotionally honest with yourself, your suffering begins to transform into awareness. And awareness changes people. A self-aware person cannot be manipulated as easily. Cannot be emotionally controlled as easily. Cannot be destroyed by rejection as easily. Why? Because they no longer build their identity on external approval. This book will force you to confront parts of yourself you may have spent years avoiding. Your ego. Your emotional addictions. Your attachment to pain. Your fear of loneliness. Your need for validation. Your silent self-hatred. Some chapters may anger you. Good. That means something inside you has been touched. Growth rarely begins with comfort. It begins with confrontation. The truth is, many people secretly enjoy blaming others forever. Because remaining a victim protects the ego from responsibility. If everything is someone else's fault, you never have to change. But healing demands something terrifying. Accountability. Not accountability for what others did to you. Accountability for what you allowed, ignored, tolerated, normalized, and refused to confront within yourself. That is where your power returns. Because the moment you stop chasing revenge, validation, and emotional control over others, you begin reclaiming control over yourself. And that is where freedom starts. Not when they apologize. Not when they regret losing you. Not when karma punishes them. But when you finally understand. Your peace was never supposed to depend on another human being. The people who hurt you may have triggered the wound. But the wound already existed. This book is about finding it, understanding it, and finally healing it. Chapter 1. Nobody controls your emotions. The hardest truth you will ever face is this. Nobody controls your emotions. Not your ex. Not your parents. Not society. Not the people who betrayed you. Not the person who ignored your message. Not the friend who replaced you. Not the stranger who disrespected you. They may trigger something inside you. But the reaction belongs to you. That is the part most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Because blaming others feels safer than confronting ourselves. It is easier to say, "They ruined me," than to admit, "I never learned how to handle pain." Most people walk through life believing emotions are created externally. Someone insults them, and anger appears. Someone leaves them, and sadness appears. Someone succeeds, and jealousy appears. But emotions do not magically enter your body from the outside world. They are activated from wounds that already exist inside you. A rejection only destroys you when it touches insecurity. A betrayal only consumes you when it awakens abandonment. Criticism only burns when it attacks your self-worth. If there were no wound, there would be no emotional explosion. This is why two people can experience the exact same event and react completely differently. One person gets rejected and moves on peacefully. Another obsesses for years. One person gets criticized and improves. Another collapses emotionally. The event is not the true source of suffering. The interpretation is. Your inner world determines the emotional weight of every experience. Most people never realize this because they confuse triggers with causes. A trigger is not the same as a cause. Imagine someone touches a bruise on your arm. You blame their hand for the pain. But the real problem was the bruise that already existed. Human emotions work the same way. People touch emotional bruises you never healed. And suddenly rage appears. Jealousy appears. Possessiveness appears. Shame appears. Then the mind creates a story. They made me feel this way. No. They revealed what was already buried inside you. That realization changes everything. Because once you understand this, you stop seeing life as a battlefield full of enemies. You begin seeing it as a mirror. Every emotional reaction becomes information. Every trigger becomes a clue. Every painful interaction reveals something unresolved inside your own mind. This does not mean people are innocent. Some people are cruel. Some are manipulative. Some betray trust intentionally. But even then, your suffering is amplified by internal wounds. A secure person can leave toxic people without destroying themselves emotionally. An insecure person becomes psychologically chained to the pain. The difference is internal stability. This is why emotional mastery is not about controlling the world. It is about understanding yourself deeply enough that the world loses its power to emotionally control you. Most people never reach this level because they are addicted to blame. Blame is seductive. Blame protects the ego. If everything is someone else's fault, then you never need to confront your own patterns. You never need to ask, why do I tolerate disrespect? Why am I addicted to validation? Why do I fear abandonment so deeply? Why do I chase people who hurt me? Why does rejection define my worth? Those questions are terrifying because they force self-awareness. And self-awareness destroys illusions. Many people are not angry because someone hurt them. They are angry because deep down, they know they abandoned themselves. They ignored intuition. They tolerated red flags. They betrayed personal boundaries. They begged for love they should have walked away from. That creates self-directed anger. But instead of facing themselves, they project the rage outward. Projection is one of the mind's favorite defense mechanisms. The ego says, it's all their fault. Because admitting personal responsibility feels painful. But healing begins the moment projection ends. You cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot become emotionally free while emotionally dependent on blaming others. Freedom begins when you say, yes, they hurt me. But my reaction reveals wounds I must heal myself. That sentence terrifies immature minds. Because it removes the fantasy that someone else will fix your inner world. No relationship can heal self-hatred. No revenge can heal insecurity. No apology can heal abandonment trauma. No external victory can repair internal chaos. At some point, responsibility becomes unavoidable. And responsibility is not punishment. It is power. The moment you take responsibility for your emotional world, your life changes completely. Because now your healing no longer depends on other people changing. You stop waiting for closure. You stop needing revenge. You stop begging for understanding. You stop making your peace dependent on someone else's behavior. You reclaim control. That is true emotional maturity. A mature person understands, my emotions are real, but they are also my responsibility. This mindset does not make you weak. It makes you powerful. Because emotionally intelligent people cannot be controlled easily. Manipulation stops working on them. Validation loses power over them. Fear loses influence over them. They become calm under pressure because they understand their internal world. Most people spend their lives trying to control others. Few learn to control themselves. But self-control is where peace begins. Not suppression. Not emotional numbness. Not pretending not to care. Real self-control means understanding your emotions without becoming enslaved by them. It means observing anger without letting it consume your identity. It means feeling sadness without collapsing into hopelessness. It means recognizing triggers without becoming ruled by them. That level of awareness transforms everything. Because eventually you realize, life is not happening to you. Life is revealing you. Every conflict reveals your ego. Every heartbreak reveals your attachments. Every trigger reveals your wounds. Every emotional reaction reveals the relationship you have with yourself. Most people never examine that relationship. They spend years mastering careers, chasing money, building status, improving appearance, and seeking admiration. While remaining strangers to their own mind. They know how to impress people. But they do not know how to sit alone with themselves. Silence terrifies them. Because silence exposes everything they have been trying to escape. The insecurity. The loneliness. The regret. The self-hatred. The emotional emptiness hidden beneath distraction. This is why so many people cannot be alone without immediately reaching for stimulation. Music. Social media. Messages. Attention. Relationships. Noise. Anything to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth inside themselves. But healing requires confrontation. Not with the world. With yourself. You must become honest about what truly controls your emotional state. Is it really other people? Or is it your attachment to being validated by them? Is it really betrayal? Or is it the pain of realizing you ignored what your intuition already knew? Is it really rejection? Or is it the belief that your worth depends on being chosen? These questions matter because emotional suffering is rarely about the surface event. It is about the meaning your mind attaches to it. A breakup becomes, I am not enough. Being ignored becomes, I am unimportant. Failure becomes, I am worthless. But events are neutral until identity becomes attached to them. That is why emotionally strong people recover faster. Not because they feel less pain, but because they do not turn every painful experience into proof that they are broken. Most suffering is not caused by pain itself. It is caused by identification with pain. You experience sadness. Then the mind says, this sadness defines me. You experience rejection. Then the mind says, no one will ever love me. You experience failure. Then the mind says, I am a failure. And slowly, emotions stop being temporary experiences. They become identity. That is where suffering deepens. Because identity is powerful. Whatever identity you repeatedly reinforce becomes psychologically real to you. If you constantly say, I am unwanted, your mind begins filtering reality through abandonment. If you constantly believe, people always leave me, you begin unconsciously expecting loss everywhere. The mind always searches for evidence to support its deepest beliefs. That is why healing is not simply about positive thinking. It is about rebuilding the relationship you have with yourself. And that process begins with awareness. Awareness of your triggers. Awareness of your emotional patterns. Awareness of your fears. Awareness of your unconscious behaviors. Without awareness, people remain trapped in emotional loops forever. Different situations. Same reactions. Different people. Same pain. They think life keeps hurting them. But often, they are repeating unconscious emotional patterns they never healed. Pain repeated long enough becomes personality. A person betrayed repeatedly may become emotionally closed. A person rejected repeatedly may become desperate for approval. A person abandoned repeatedly may become clingy or avoidant. Over time, survival mechanisms become identity traits. And eventually people say, this is just who I am. No. This is who pain trained you to become. But learned emotional patterns can be unlearned. That is the hope most people never hear. You are not permanently damaged. You are conditioned. And conditioning can change. But change requires responsibility. Not shame. Not self-hatred. Not guilt. Responsibility. There is a difference. Shame says, I am broken. Responsibility says, I need to heal. Shame traps people. Responsibility frees them. Because responsibility returns power to your hands. When you stop blaming the world for your emotional state, you stop waiting for the world to rescue you. You begin rescuing yourself. That is the beginning of inner strength. Not pretending nothing hurts, but refusing to let pain control your identity. Real strength is emotional honesty. The ability to say, yes, I am hurt. Yes, I am angry. Yes, I feel abandoned. But I will not let these emotions define my life forever. That mindset changes everything. Because eventually you stop chasing emotional control over others. You stop trying to force love, force loyalty, force understanding, force validation. And instead, you build something far more powerful. Inner stability. A stable person does not collapse every time life becomes uncomfortable. They feel pain without becoming consumed by it. They experience rejection without losing self-worth. They survive endings without losing identity. Because their emotional foundation no longer depends entirely on external circumstances. That is freedom. And freedom changes the way you move through the world. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop begging for attention. You stop attaching your worth to who stays and who leaves. You stop seeing every painful experience as proof that life is against you. Instead, you begin asking deeper questions. What is this situation teaching me about myself? What wound has been activated? What belief about myself created this emotional reaction? What part of me still needs healing? Those questions transform suffering into awareness. And awareness transforms people. Because once you truly understand yourself, the world loses much of its power to emotionally destroy you. You become calmer, clearer, more emotionally disciplined. Not because life becomes easier, but because your relationship with yourself becomes stronger. And once that happens, everything changes. Because finally, you understand the truth most people spend their entire lives running from. Nobody controls your emotions. They only reveal the places where you have not yet learned to heal yourself. Chapter 2. The Mirror Effect. The people who hurt you are often mirrors. Not always intentional mirrors. Not always wise mirrors. Not always good people. But mirrors nonetheless. Because certain people enter your life not to complete you, but to reveal you. That is why some relationships feel almost supernatural in their intensity. They awaken emotions you did not even know existed inside you. Obsession, jealousy, neediness, possessiveness, fear, insecurity, emotional dependence. Suddenly, someone's text message controls your mood. Their attention becomes your emotional oxygen. Their silence feels like punishment. Their approval feels like survival. And when they leave, it feels like your entire identity collapses. Most people think this means that person was special. Sometimes they were. But often, what felt powerful was not love. It was activation. They activated wounds that already existed beneath your personality. This is why relationships can become emotionally addictive. Not because the connection is healthy, but because the connection touches unresolved emotional pain from your past. Many people are not chasing love. They are chasing emotional familiarity. And emotional familiarity is dangerous because the mind prefers what feels familiar over what feels healthy. A person who grew up feeling emotionally ignored may become addicted to unavailable partners. A person who never felt chosen may become obsessed with validation. A person abandoned in childhood may panic whenever someone becomes distant. Without realizing it, people recreate emotional environments that match their deepest wounds. Then they call it chemistry. But chemistry is not always compatibility. Sometimes it is trauma recognizing itself. That is why toxic relationships can feel impossible to leave. The pain feels familiar. The chaos feels normal. The unpredictability feels emotionally stimulating. And the nervous system confuses emotional intensity with love. Healthy love often feels calm. But calm feels uncomfortable to wounded people. Because wounded minds are addicted to emotional turbulence. Silence feels suspicious. Peace feels boring. Stability feels unfamiliar. So they unconsciously chase emotionally unavailable people because emotional struggle feels meaningful to them. This is the mirror effect. People reveal the relationship you have with yourself. The person who constantly disrespects your boundaries reveals how little you protect yourself. The person whose approval controls your emotions reveals your dependence on validation. The person you cannot let go of reveals your fear of loneliness. The person you obsess over reveals the parts of yourself you feel disconnected from. Every attachment contains information. This is why heartbreak can become transformational. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because pain destroys illusions. During emotional pain, masks begin to fall. You finally see how much of your identity was built around external approval. How much self-worth depended on being chosen. How much energy was spent trying to earn love. And perhaps the most painful realization of all. You were abandoning yourself while trying to keep someone else. That realization changes people forever. Because eventually, you understand that the deepest betrayal was not always theirs. It was yours. You betrayed your intuition when it warned you. You betrayed your standards to avoid losing them. You betrayed your self-respect to maintain connection. You betrayed your emotional truth to keep the peace. Then when everything collapses, the mind focuses entirely on the other person. Because focusing on them prevents you from confronting yourself. This is why many people remain emotionally stuck for years. They obsess over what happened externally while ignoring what happened internally. But healing begins when the focus shifts inward. Not inward in a self-destructive way. Inward in an honest way. Instead of asking, "How could they do this to me?" you begin asking, "Why was I willing to tolerate this?" That question is uncomfortable. But it is transformational. Because emotionally mature people understand something most humans never learn. What you tolerate reveals what you believe you deserve. If you tolerate disrespect repeatedly, somewhere inside you, your self-worth is wounded. If you constantly chase unavailable people, somewhere inside you, love feels connected to suffering. If you fear being alone more than being mistreated, somewhere inside you, you do not feel complete by yourself. None of this means you are weak. It means you are human. Every person carries invisible emotional programming shaped by childhood, relationships, rejection, and pain. Most people never examine it. They simply repeat the same emotional cycles with different faces. Different names. Different bodies. Same wounds. The mirror changes. The reflection stays the same. That is why some people date the same personality for 20 years without realizing it. Different partner. Same emotional experience. Because unresolved wounds recreate familiar realities. Life keeps sending mirrors until awareness develops. And awareness can be painful. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend not to see it. You begin noticing your need for validation, your fear of abandonment, your addiction to attention, your emotional dependency, your avoidance of loneliness, your inability to set boundaries. At first, this awareness feels brutal. But eventually it becomes liberating. Because you stop seeing yourself as powerless. You realize your patterns can change. Your emotional reactions can heal. Your attachments can evolve. And most importantly, you stop expecting other people to complete wounds they did not create. That is the moment emotional freedom begins. Not when someone finally loves you correctly. But when you finally stop abandoning yourself in the pursuit of love. Most people enter relationships hoping another person will repair what they secretly hate about themselves. They want someone to make them feel worthy, make them feel attractive, make them feel important, make them feel emotionally safe, make them feel complete. And for a while, love can create that illusion. Attention becomes temporary medicine. Affection becomes emotional escape. Validation becomes identity reinforcement. But eventually reality returns. Because no human being can permanently carry the weight of another person's emotional emptiness. Sooner or later, insecurity resurfaces. Fear resurfaces. Neediness resurfaces. And when the relationship begins cracking, the hidden wounds underneath become impossible to ignore. This is why breakups often feel psychologically devastating. The pain is not only about losing another person. It is about losing the emotional identity you built around them. Without them, you no longer know who you are. That is why people beg for closure when what they truly lost was their sense of self. The relationship became a distraction from inner emptiness. And now the emptiness returns stronger than before. That is the hidden purpose of mirrors. They expose the emotional dependencies you never realized controlled your life. Some mirrors reveal insecurity. Some reveal ego. Some reveal loneliness. Some reveal desperation for approval. Some reveal childhood wounds still shaping adult relationships. And until those wounds are acknowledged, life repeats the lesson in different forms. You may change cities, change partners, change environments, but unresolved emotional patterns travel with you. Because wherever you go, you bring yourself with you. That is why external change alone rarely creates peace. People think, if I find the right relationship, I will finally feel whole. But wholeness cannot be outsourced. Love can support healing, but it cannot replace it. A healthy relationship should add to your life, not become your entire emotional foundation. The moment another person becomes responsible for your identity, emotional suffering becomes inevitable. Because humans are imperfect. They change. They leave. They disappoint. They fail. And if your self-worth depends entirely on them, your emotional world collapses every time they do. This is why self-awareness matters more than romance. Without self-awareness, people unconsciously turn relationships into emotional survival systems. They do not love peacefully. They attach fearfully. They cling, control, overthink, obsess, monitor, panic. Not because they are evil, but because they are terrified of losing the emotional security they never built within themselves. True healing begins when you stop asking other people to save you from yourself. That is maturity. Not becoming cold. Not becoming detached from emotion. But learning how to emotionally stand on your own feet. To enjoy love without depending on it for identity. To appreciate connection without losing yourself inside it. To walk away from disrespect without feeling psychologically destroyed. That is emotional independence. And emotionally independent people experience relationships differently. They still love deeply. But they no longer worship people. They no longer sacrifice self-respect for attention. They no longer mistake emotional chaos for passion. They no longer chase those who clearly do not value them. Because once you truly heal, your standards change. You stop asking, how do I make them stay? And start asking, why would I want someone who makes me abandon myself? That question changes everything. Because finally, the mirror stops being your prison and becomes your teacher. And sometimes the people who shattered your heart were never meant to stay forever. Sometimes they entered your life for one brutal purpose: to show you the parts of yourself you could no longer afford to ignore. Chapter 3. Betrayal hurts because you betrayed yourself first. Most people believe betrayal begins the moment someone lies, cheats, leaves, or breaks trust. But betrayal usually starts long before that. It begins the moment you start abandoning yourself. Long before the relationship collapsed. Long before the disrespect became obvious. Long before the final argument. There were signs. Your intuition noticed them. Your body felt them. Your silence protected them. But you ignored yourself to keep the connection alive. That is why betrayal cuts so deeply. Not only because someone hurt you, but because deep down, you know you participated in your own suffering. You saw the red flags and called them misunderstandings. You felt uncomfortable and called it overthinking. You lowered your standards and called it love. You tolerated disrespect and called it patience. You silenced your needs and called it maturity. You abandoned your emotional truth to avoid losing someone. And when everything finally collapsed, the pain became unbearable because the mind realized something devastating. I knew. That realization creates a very specific type of emotional pain. Self-betrayal. The kind of pain that keeps people awake at night replaying memories over and over again. Not because they are only angry at the other person, but because they are angry at themselves for ignoring what they already felt. Most people do not trust their intuition because intuition rarely sounds dramatic. It whispers. Quiet discomfort. Subtle anxiety. Emotional exhaustion. Confusion that never fully leaves. Your body often recognizes danger before your mind accepts it. But people ignore inner warnings because they fear loss more than suffering. That is the tragedy. Humans will tolerate emotional pain for months or years simply to avoid temporary loneliness. They stay in unhealthy relationships because uncertainty feels terrifying. They settle for inconsistency because inconsistency feels better than emptiness. They accept partial love because they secretly fear receiving none at all. And eventually survival becomes self-betrayal. This happens in friendships too. You notice the imbalance, the disrespect, the manipulation, the one-sided energy. But you continue giving because you hope loyalty will eventually be returned. Sometimes it never is. And when people finally reveal their true nature, the pain becomes doubled. One part hurts because they disappointed you. The other part hurts because you ignored yourself for them. That second pain is deeper. Because betrayal from others wounds trust in people. But self-betrayal wounds trust in yourself. And once trust in yourself is damaged, every future decision becomes harder. You start questioning your judgment, your intuition, your perception. How did I not see this? But usually you did see it. You just hoped love would change reality. Hope is dangerous when it becomes denial. Many people are not in love with who someone truly is. They are in love with potential. Potential is one of the most psychologically addictive illusions in human relationships. You see glimpses of kindness and ignore patterns of disrespect. You remember beautiful moments and minimize emotional damage. You hold on to who they could become, while suffering from who they repeatedly show themselves to be. That is emotional self-abandonment. And the longer it continues, the more resentment builds internally. Eventually, people become consumed with anger. But if they are completely honest, the anger is not only directed outward. Part of it says, "Why did I stay? Why did I tolerate this? Why did I keep begging for something that was hurting me?" That inner conflict destroys peace. Because humans can survive pain more easily than they can survive the feeling that they betrayed their own soul. This is why self-respect matters more than attachment. Attachment says, "Don't leave me." Self-respect says, "I will not abandon myself to keep you." Most people choose attachment. Especially wounded people. Especially lonely people. Especially people who never learned that love should not require self-destruction. So they overgive, overexplain, overforgive, overstay. And slowly, their identity erodes. They become emotionally exhausted because pretending not to be hurt requires enormous psychological energy. Every ignored boundary creates internal tension. Every tolerated disrespect creates hidden resentment. Every act of self-betrayal weakens inner stability. Then eventually something snaps. Sometimes it is a breakup. Sometimes it is betrayal. Sometimes it is emotional burnout. Sometimes it is complete numbness. But beneath all of it lies one painful truth. You cannot build peace while betraying yourself daily. That is why healing requires radical honesty. Not only about what others did, but about what you allowed. This does not mean blaming yourself for being mistreated. Compassion matters. Humans ignore red flags for many reasons. Fear of loneliness, childhood conditioning, low self-worth, trauma bonding, emotional dependency, hope, insecurity. Understanding your patterns is not self-hatred. It is self-awareness. And self-awareness is where transformation begins. Because once you understand why you abandoned yourself, you stop repeating the same emotional cycle. You stop confusing love with sacrifice. You stop romanticizing suffering. You stop seeing emotional pain as proof of connection. And perhaps most importantly, you begin rebuilding trust with yourself. That process changes everything. Trusting yourself means listening when something feels wrong. It means honoring discomfort instead of suppressing it. It means respecting your emotional boundaries even when attachment begs you not to. Most people think confidence comes from success. But real confidence comes from self-trust. The knowledge that, I will protect myself emotionally. That creates inner peace. Because no matter who enters your life, you know you will not betray your own values to keep them. Emotionally healthy people are not fearless. They simply fear self-abandonment more than rejection. That is the difference. They would rather lose another person than lose themselves. Many people never learn this lesson until pain forces them to. A betrayal becomes the wake-up call. The relationship ends. The illusion collapses. And suddenly they realize how much of themselves they sacrificed trying to maintain connection. At first this realization feels devastating. But eventually it becomes liberating. Because once you stop abandoning yourself, your entire life changes. Your standards rise. Your intuition sharpens. Your tolerance for manipulation decreases. Your need for external validation weakens. And relationships stop feeling like emotional survival. They become choices instead of addictions. That is maturity. The ability to love without losing yourself. To care deeply without tolerating disrespect. To walk away without collapsing emotionally. To choose peace over attachment. Most people think heartbreak destroys them. Sometimes heartbreak introduces them to themselves for the first time. Because pain strips away illusion. And once illusion dies, clarity begins. You finally see where you ignored yourself. Where you begged for less than you deserved. Where loneliness controlled your decisions. Where fear overpowered self-respect. Where attachment blinded your judgment. That awareness is painful. But it is also powerful. Because now the cycle can end. You no longer need to chase people who drain your spirit. You no longer need to convince others to value you. You no longer need to tolerate emotional chaos to feel loved. You begin understanding something life-changing. Love should never require the destruction of your dignity. Real love does not ask you to betray your intuition. Real love does not punish honesty. Real love does not force you to shrink yourself for acceptance. And the moment you fully understand that, you stop chasing relationships at the cost of your soul. Because finally, you realize, the deepest betrayal was never only what they did to you. It was how long you abandoned yourself while hoping they would change. Chapter 4. Your ego is bleeding. Not every emotional reaction comes from the heart. Many come from the ego. And most people cannot tell the difference. They think they are devastated because they lost someone they loved. But sometimes they are devastated because they lost someone who validated them. There is a difference. Love says, I care about you. Ego says, I need you to make me feel important. When the ego becomes emotionally attached, relationships stop being about connection and start becoming about identity. That is why rejection feels so violent to some people. It is not only emotional pain. It is ego collapse. Someone choosing another person over you. Someone ignoring you. Someone replacing you. Someone walking away without begging to stay. These experiences wound the ego because they attack the image you built about yourself. The ego wants certainty. It wants to feel superior. Wanted. Chosen. Irreplaceable. Important. So when reality challenges that image, emotional chaos begins. Suddenly you are not only grieving the person. You are grieving the version of yourself you believed existed through them. The attractive version. The special version. The powerful version. The unforgettable version. This is why some people become obsessed after rejection. Not because they deeply loved the other person. But because their ego cannot tolerate being unwanted. The ego takes rejection personally. It interprets loss as humiliation. That humiliation becomes rage. Not always visible rage. Sometimes quiet rage. The kind hidden beneath obsessive thoughts, stalking social media, comparing yourself to others, craving revenge, needing closure, fantasizing about proving your worth. The ego desperately wants emotional control restored. It wants the final word, the final victory, the final validation. Because the ego fears one thing above all: insignificance. That fear controls more human behavior than most people realize. Many people do not chase love. They chase proof that they matter. And when that proof disappears, they collapse internally. This is why emotionally wounded people often say, "How could they move on so fast?" But the hidden question underneath is usually, "How could someone stop choosing me?" That is ego pain. The ego attaches identity to external attention. So when attention disappears, self-worth disappears with it. This is dangerous. Because anything external can be taken away. Beauty changes. Relationships end. Status disappears. People leave. If your identity depends entirely on external validation, emotional suffering becomes inevitable. The ego creates fragile self-worth. A fragile person needs constant reassurance, constant attention, constant proof. And because no human being can provide endless validation forever, disappointment becomes unavoidable. That disappointment often turns into resentment. Not because expectations were realistic, but because the ego believed emotional needs should be constantly fulfilled by others. This is why people become controlling in relationships. Not always out of cruelty. Often out of fear. The ego fears losing emotional supply. It fears abandonment because abandonment threatens identity. So people try to control what they cannot emotionally survive losing. They monitor messages, seek reassurance constantly, become jealous easily, overreact to distance, interpret everything personally. The ego interprets uncertainty as danger. But healthy love cannot exist where control dominates. Control suffocates connection. Real love requires emotional security. And emotional security cannot exist without inner stability. This is why healing the ego matters. Not destroying it completely, but understanding it. The ego itself is not evil. It helps humans survive socially. But an unconscious ego creates suffering. Especially when identity becomes dependent on being admired, desired, or emotionally prioritized by others. A healthy person can experience rejection without losing self-worth. An ego-driven person experiences rejection as psychological annihilation. That is why some people cannot let go. Not because love remains, but because the ego refuses defeat. They replay memories repeatedly. Not to heal, but to restore emotional superiority. They want the other person to regret leaving, to suffer, to come back begging, to finally recognize their value. Why? Because the ego wants revenge against humiliation. Humiliation is one of the most painful emotions humans experience. And beneath many emotional breakdowns lies wounded pride. Not genuine heartbreak. Wounded pride. The pain of realizing you were not as important to them as you believed. That realization crushes illusion. Especially if your identity depended on feeling special to someone. This is why breakups often trigger identity crises. Without the relationship, people no longer know who they are. Because their personality became emotionally fused with external validation. When validation disappeared, emptiness surfaced. That emptiness existed long before the relationship. But attention temporarily covered it. This is why distractions feel addictive. Attention silences insecurity temporarily. But temporary silence is not healing. Once the distraction disappears, unresolved insecurity returns stronger than before. The ego hates this. Because the ego wants quick relief, not deep transformation. It wants validation instead of self-awareness. Distraction instead of healing. Approval instead of inner peace. But eventually life forces confrontation. Especially through rejection. Rejection exposes ego dependency brutally. It reveals how much self-worth depended on attention. How deeply comparison controls your emotions. How attached you became to being chosen. How terrified you were of being ordinary. How emotionally dependent you became on external approval. At first this awareness feels painful. But it is necessary. Because the ego survives through illusion. Healing begins through truth. And the truth is, no amount of external validation can permanently heal internal emptiness. Not relationships. Not success. Not admiration. Not fame. Not attention. If you secretly hate yourself, external praise becomes emotional addiction. You constantly need more of it to temporarily escape inner insecurity. That is why some people are never satisfied. No amount of love feels enough. No amount of reassurance feels permanent. No amount of success creates peace. Because the wound is internal. And internal wounds cannot be healed externally forever. Sooner or later, you must face yourself without distractions. Without applause. Without validation. Without emotional dependency. That is where true healing begins. Not when everyone loves you. But when you no longer require constant proof of your worth to feel valuable. That is emotional freedom. Freedom from needing attention to feel alive. Freedom from needing revenge to feel powerful. Freedom from needing someone else's regret to feel worthy. Emotionally mature people stop building identity around being chosen. They build identity around character. Integrity. Self-respect. Discipline. Emotional awareness. Inner peace. These things cannot be taken away by rejection. That creates stability. And stable people move differently through life. They still feel pain. But pain no longer destroys their identity. They can lose relationships without losing themselves. They can experience rejection without collapsing emotionally. Because their worth no longer depends entirely on how others perceive them. That is the death of ego dependency. Not becoming emotionless. Not becoming cold. But becoming internally grounded. Many people fear ego death because they mistake it for weakness. In reality, ego death often creates strength for the first time. Because once the need to constantly prove yourself disappears, peace becomes possible. You stop performing for validation. You stop chasing attention. You stop needing to win emotionally. You stop turning every rejection into a war against your self-worth. Instead, you begin living authentically. And authenticity is powerful because it removes emotional desperation. You no longer need to convince everyone to value you. You no longer need to force connection. You no longer need to manipulate perception to feel important. You simply become real, calm, secure, self-aware. And eventually you realize something most people never understand. The pain was never only about losing another person. It was also about losing the ego identity you created around being loved by them. Once that illusion breaks, real healing can finally begin. Chapter 5. The War Inside Your Mind. The most exhausting battles are invisible. No blood. No weapons. No witnesses. Just a mind at war with itself. Most people think their suffering comes from the outside world. But often the deepest pain is internal conflict. One part of you wants peace. Another part keeps replaying the past. One part wants to let go. Another part stays emotionally attached to pain. One part knows the relationship was unhealthy. Another part still craves the person who hurt you. This inner division destroys emotional stability. Because the human mind was never designed to live peacefully while fighting itself every day. That is why some people look fine externally while collapsing internally. They smile in public and suffer in silence. They function physically while emotionally drowning. The war never stops. Every memory becomes a battlefield. Every quiet moment becomes mental torture. And eventually exhaustion replaces peace. Most people do not realize how much energy unresolved emotions consume. Suppressing pain requires energy. Pretending to be okay requires energy. Overthinking requires energy. Resentment requires energy. Self-hatred requires enormous psychological energy. That is why emotionally wounded people often feel physically tired all the time. The mind and body are deeply connected. A chaotic inner world eventually affects sleep, focus, motivation, appetite, confidence, and even physical health. But instead of confronting the real problem, many people distract themselves. Work, entertainment, social media, attention, relationships, noise, anything to avoid being alone with their own thoughts. Because silence exposes unresolved pain. And unresolved pain is terrifying when ignored for too long. Many people secretly fear stillness because stillness removes distraction. Suddenly the mind becomes loud. Regret surfaces. Loneliness surfaces. Shame surfaces. Memories surface. The emotional wounds buried beneath daily routines begin demanding attention. This is why nighttime feels emotionally heavier for many people. Darkness removes external stimulation. And when the world becomes quiet, the mind finally speaks. Sometimes brutally. You were not enough. You ruined everything. No one truly loves you. You always get abandoned. You are weak. These thoughts feel personal. But often they are echoes from old emotional wounds. Especially childhood wounds. Many adult emotional struggles are simply younger pain wearing older faces. A child who constantly felt criticized may grow into an adult terrified of failure. A child who felt emotionally abandoned may become clingy or emotionally avoidant. A child who never felt truly seen may spend adulthood addicted to validation. The adult personality is often built around unresolved emotional survival strategies. Most people never examine this. They simply call it personality. This is just how I am. But many behaviors are not identity. They are adaptation. The anxious person adapted to unpredictability. The emotionally distant person adapted to pain. The people pleaser adapted to rejection. The perfectionist adapted to conditional love. Understanding this changes everything. Because it means your emotional patterns are not proof that you are broken. They are proof that you survived emotionally the best way you knew how. But survival mechanisms eventually become prisons. What once protected you may now destroy your peace. People-pleasing may have protected you from rejection once. Now it destroys self-respect. Emotional numbness may have protected you from pain once. Now it blocks intimacy. Hyper-independence may have protected you from disappointment once. Now it prevents connection. This is why healing feels uncomfortable. Because healing often requires abandoning emotional habits that once helped you survive. The mind resists this. Familiar suffering feels safer than unfamiliar peace. That sentence explains many human behaviors. People stay in painful situations because pain feels predictable. And predictability creates psychological comfort. Even toxic comfort can feel addictive. This is why people repeat destructive emotional cycles. The mind unconsciously chooses familiarity over freedom. That is the hidden war inside many people. Consciously they want peace. Unconsciously they recreate pain they already understand. This creates emotional confusion. They sabotage healthy relationships. Distrust genuine love. Push away emotionally available people. Then chase emotionally unavailable ones. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because chaos feels emotionally familiar. The nervous system becomes addicted to emotional survival mode. And eventually calmness feels suspicious. This internal conflict exhausts people. Part of them wants healing. Another part fears who they will become without pain. Because many people build identity around suffering. The abandoned person. The betrayed person. The misunderstood person. The rejected person. Pain becomes personality. And letting go of pain begins to feel like losing identity itself. That is why healing is not simply emotional recovery. It is identity transformation. You must become someone new psychologically. Someone who no longer needs suffering to understand themselves. Someone who no longer confuses emotional chaos with depth. Someone who no longer builds self-worth around wounds. This process is difficult because the ego often clings to pain. Pain can create significance. People begin attaching meaning to their suffering. My pain makes me special. My suffering proves how deeply I loved. My wounds define who I am. But wounds are experiences, not identity. You are not your heartbreak. Not your trauma. Not your rejection. Not your abandonment. These things affected you. But they are not the entirety of you. The mind forgets this during emotional pain. Especially during prolonged suffering. Negative thoughts repeated long enough begin feeling like truth. That is dangerous. Because thoughts shape emotional reality. A person constantly repeating, "I am unlovable," will begin emotionally filtering reality through rejection. A person constantly believing, "Everyone leaves," will unconsciously expect abandonment everywhere. Eventually the mind stops observing reality objectively. It starts searching for evidence to confirm emotional fears. This creates self-fulfilling emotional cycles. Fear of abandonment creates clinginess. Clinginess creates pressure. Pressure damages relationships. Then abandonment happens. And the mind says, "See, everyone leaves." The original wound becomes reinforced. This is how unresolved pain keeps reproducing itself psychologically. Healing interrupts this cycle. But healing requires awareness first. You must become conscious of the war happening inside your own mind. Conscious of your patterns. Your triggers. Your emotional addictions. Your unconscious beliefs about yourself. Most people avoid this level of honesty because self-awareness can feel brutal. It forces you to confront truths you spent years escaping. Your insecurity. Your fear. Your emotional dependency. Your need for validation. Your hidden shame. But avoidance never creates peace. Avoidance delays confrontation. Eventually life forces you inward. Usually through pain. Pain is often the doorway to self-awareness. Not because suffering is noble, but because suffering strips away illusion. Distraction stops working eventually. Denial collapses eventually. And when it does, you meet yourself honestly for the first time. That meeting changes everything. Because eventually you realize, the real battle was never against other people. It was against the wounded parts of yourself controlling your life unconsciously. That realization creates compassion. Not weakness. Compassion. You stop seeing yourself as broken. You begin seeing yourself as wounded. And wounds can heal. But healing requires patience. The mind does not transform overnight. Years of emotional conditioning cannot disappear instantly. There will still be triggers. Still moments of sadness. Still moments where old patterns return. But awareness changes your relationship with them. Instead of becoming consumed by emotions, you begin observing them. You notice, this reaction comes from fear. This anger comes from shame. This attachment comes from loneliness. Awareness creates separation between you and your emotions. That separation is powerful. Because once emotions stop defining your identity, they lose much of their control over you. You stop becoming every thought you think, every fear you feel, every wound you carry. You begin realizing emotions are experiences, not commands, not identity, not destiny. And once you understand that, the war inside your mind slowly begins to quiet. Chapter 6. Why you keep replaying the past. The mind revisits what the heart has not resolved. That is why some memories refuse to die. You tell yourself to move on. You distract yourself. You stay busy. You try meeting new people. But at night, the past returns. A conversation replays in your head. A face appears suddenly in your mind. An old message feels emotionally alive again. And without warning, you are reliving emotions you thought you escaped. Most people believe this happens because they miss the person. Sometimes they do. But often, they are addicted to unfinished emotional experiences. The human mind hates unresolved emotional tension. It constantly searches for closure, understanding, explanation, and emotional completion. That is why painful memories replay repeatedly. The brain is trying to solve something emotionally unfinished. What did I do wrong? Why was I not enough? Did they ever truly love me? Could I have changed the outcome? The mind searches endlessly for answers because uncertainty feels psychologically unbearable. Especially after emotional pain. Humans can often survive painful truth more easily than emotional ambiguity. At least certainty allows acceptance. But unanswered questions create mental loops. The brain keeps revisiting the past hoping to gain control over what already ended. That is why overthinking feels compulsive. You are not just remembering. You are mentally trying to rewrite emotional reality. Trying to find the perfect explanation. The perfect response. The perfect version of events where pain could have been avoided. But the past does not change through obsession. It only becomes emotionally heavier. Most people trapped in the past are not only attached to another person. They are attached to who they were during that time. The fantasy they created. The emotional highs they experienced. The version of life they imagined. That is why letting go feels so difficult. You are not only grieving reality. You are grieving possibility. The future you imagined together. The identity you built around the relationship. The emotional certainty you believed existed. When that fantasy collapses, the mind struggles to accept reality. So it returns repeatedly to memories searching for emotional rescue. But memories are deceptive. The mind rarely replays relationships accurately. Especially after loss. It selectively remembers emotional highs while minimizing emotional suffering. One beautiful moment becomes emotionally louder than months of disrespect. One affectionate memory overshadows constant inconsistency. Why? Because the brain is emotionally attached to dopamine. Human relationships create chemical addiction. Attention. Affection. Validation. Unpredictability. All of these stimulate powerful emotional responses in the nervous system. This is why toxic relationships often become the hardest to forget. Not because they were healthiest, but because unpredictability intensifies emotional addiction. The brain becomes conditioned to emotional highs and lows. Pain followed by affection. Distance followed by attention. Coldness followed by intimacy. This inconsistency creates psychological dependency. The nervous system becomes addicted to emotional uncertainty itself. And when the relationship ends, withdrawal begins. That withdrawal is real, not imaginary. Your body and mind crave emotional stimulation they became conditioned to receive. This is why people check old messages repeatedly. Stalk social media. Replay conversations. Listen to songs connected to memories. The mind is searching for emotional dopamine connected to the past. At first this behavior feels comforting. But eventually it becomes self-destruction. Because every emotional revisit reopens wounds. Healing becomes impossible when the mind continuously feeds attachment. Most people think they are healing while secretly emotionally relapsing every day. They say, "I'm trying to move on." But mentally they revisit the same pain constantly. The same memories. The same fantasies. The same emotional wounds. And repetition strengthens emotional attachment. The mind becomes trapped in emotional loops because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. Even painful familiarity. This is why some people stay emotionally attached to relationships that destroyed them. The pain became psychologically familiar. And the unfamiliar future feels terrifying. The past may hurt. But at least the past is known. Unknown futures create anxiety. So the mind returns to old pain because pain feels emotionally predictable. That is the tragedy of unresolved attachment. People choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar peace. But eventually the exhaustion becomes unbearable. You become tired of replaying the same memories. Tired of analyzing the same conversations. Tired of emotionally bleeding from experiences already over. And slowly, a deeper realization begins forming. The past is no longer hurting you. Your attachment to the past is. That realization changes everything. Because now healing becomes possible. Not through forgetting. But through understanding. You begin realizing that overthinking is often emotional resistance. The mind replays the past because part of you refuses to accept reality fully. Acceptance feels painful because acceptance kills fantasy. Once you truly accept something is over, the emotional illusion dies. Many people delay healing because fantasy feels emotionally safer than truth. Fantasy says, maybe they will come back. Maybe things could still change. Maybe they secretly miss me. Fantasy temporarily protects the ego from grief. But fantasy also traps people emotionally. Reality is painful. But reality heals. Fantasy comforts temporarily while extending suffering indefinitely. This is why emotionally mature people eventually choose truth over emotional illusion. Even when truth hurts. Because they understand something important. Healing requires acceptance, not obsession. Acceptance does not mean pretending something never mattered. It means stopping the psychological war against reality. It means saying, yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt. Yes, I wish things were different. But I cannot heal while emotionally living in a past that no longer exists. That is strength. Not emotional numbness. Not pretending not to care. But refusing to let old memories control your present life forever. The mind resists this initially. Especially if emotional pain became connected to identity. Some people replay the past because pain became part of who they are. They no longer know themselves outside suffering. Without heartbreak, resentment, longing, or grief. They feel emotionally empty. So unconsciously, they keep the pain alive. Because pain feels more familiar than peace. This is why healing can feel strangely uncomfortable. Peace feels unfamiliar to wounded minds. Calmness feels unnatural after years of emotional chaos. But eventually the nervous system learns safety again. And when it does, something beautiful happens. The memories lose emotional power. You still remember. But the memories stop controlling you. You stop romanticizing what hurt you. You stop idealizing people who repeatedly damaged your peace. You stop confusing emotional addiction with love. Clarity begins replacing obsession. And clarity is freeing. Because clarity allows you to finally see the relationship honestly. Not only the beautiful moments. But also the anxiety, inconsistency, emotional exhaustion, self-abandonment, and pain. You stop editing reality emotionally. You stop turning suffering into romance. And slowly, your energy returns to the present moment. That is where life exists. Not in memory. Not in fantasy. Not in emotional replay. Here. Now. Most people lose years psychologically trapped inside moments already gone. But life keeps moving. And healing begins the moment you decide. The past may shape me. But it will no longer imprison me. Because eventually you understand something life-changing. You do not heal by replaying the wound endlessly. You heal by learning from it. And finally allowing yourself to live beyond it. Chapter 7. The person you hate lives inside you. The traits you hate most in others often exist inside you somewhere. Not always in the exact same form. Not always consciously. But emotionally, psychologically, symbolically. They live within you. That truth makes people uncomfortable. Because humans prefer seeing themselves as victims of other people's flaws rather than confronting the parts of themselves they reject internally. So they judge harshly. The arrogant person hates arrogance. The liar hates dishonesty. The controlling person hates being controlled. The insecure person hates confident people. The emotionally unavailable person hates emotional distance. Why? Because other people often reflect hidden aspects of ourselves we have not accepted. This psychological process is called projection. Projection happens when the mind rejects something internally and unconsciously sees it everywhere externally. The person who feels weak becomes obsessed with appearing powerful. The person full of shame becomes hypercritical of others. The person who secretly fears rejection becomes extremely sensitive to disrespect. Humans constantly project unconscious emotions onto the world around them. That is why emotional reactions are rarely only about the present moment. They are connected to hidden internal wounds. Sometimes the person you hate is simply expressing a trait you spent your entire life suppressing inside yourself. A person raised to always be nice may secretly envy selfish people because selfish people express boundaries they never learned to have. A person taught to suppress anger may become obsessed with aggressive people because aggression represents power they feel disconnected from internally. A deeply insecure person may hate confident individuals because confidence reminds them of what they lack within themselves. The shadow always reveals itself through emotional reactions. Most people never confront their shadow self. Instead, they spend their lives running from it. The shadow self contains the parts of you that were rejected, suppressed, denied, or hidden to gain acceptance from others. Your anger, your jealousy, your selfishness, your fear, your neediness, your insecurity, your hunger for validation. As children, humans quickly learn which emotions are acceptable and which are not. So they create masks. The good child suppresses anger. The strong person suppresses vulnerability. The independent person suppresses emotional needs. The nice person suppresses resentment. But suppressed emotions do not disappear. They go underground. And eventually they begin controlling behavior unconsciously. This is why emotionally repressed people often explode unexpectedly. Years of suppressed emotion suddenly erupt through rage, manipulation, emotional breakdowns, or destructive behavior. The shadow always demands expression eventually. Ignoring it only strengthens it. That is why self-awareness is uncomfortable. Because true self-awareness means admitting, I am not only the good parts of myself. You are also the insecure parts. The selfish parts. The jealous parts. The wounded parts. The manipulative parts. The fearful parts. And denying these parts does not make you pure. It makes you unconscious. Conscious people acknowledge their darkness. Unconscious people project it onto others constantly. This is why some people obsessively criticize everyone around them. They are fighting hidden aspects of themselves externally. The judgment they direct outward is often internal shame disguised as superiority. That is why people who hate themselves deeply are often the most judgmental. They cannot tolerate imperfection internally, so they attack it externally. But healing begins when projection ends. When you stop asking, "Why are people like this?" and start asking, "Why does this trigger me so deeply?" That question changes everything. Because triggers reveal emotional wounds. If someone's confidence makes you angry, perhaps insecurity exists within you. If someone's rejection destroys you emotionally, perhaps your self-worth depends too heavily on external validation. If someone's selfishness enrages you, perhaps part of you secretly wishes you had stronger boundaries. Your emotional reactions reveal your unconscious relationship with yourself. This does not mean every criticism is projection. Some behaviors are genuinely harmful. Some people truly are toxic. But the intensity of emotional reaction often reveals something deeper happening internally. Emotionally secure people do not become consumed by every external flaw. They notice behavior without psychologically drowning in it. Why? Because they are not at war with themselves internally. Internal peace changes perception. A person comfortable with their own flaws becomes less obsessed with controlling or judging everyone else. That is maturity. Not perfection. But self-awareness without denial. Many people spend their lives building false identities to avoid confronting their shadow. They create personas. The strong one. The perfect one. The successful one. The spiritual one. The emotionally detached one. But beneath every mask lives the rejected self. The frightened child. The insecure mind. The wounded ego. The unmet emotional needs. And no amount of external success permanently silences these hidden parts. Eventually life forces confrontation. Usually through relationships. Relationships expose the shadow brutally. Jealousy surfaces. Possessiveness surfaces. Control surfaces. Fear surfaces. Suddenly the image you had of yourself begins cracking. You thought you were emotionally independent until attachment exposed dependency. You thought you were calm until rejection exposed insecurity. You thought you were healed until betrayal exposed unresolved pain. Relationships do not create your shadow. They reveal it. That is why intimacy feels terrifying for many people. Real intimacy destroys masks. And masks feel safer than vulnerability. A mask can be controlled. A real human self cannot. So people hide behind perfection, sarcasm, emotional distance, success, or performance. Anything to avoid being truly seen. Because being seen means risking rejection. And rejection threatens the wounded ego deeply. But avoiding vulnerability creates loneliness. A person who constantly hides their authentic self may receive attention, but never truly feels loved. Because deep down they know people are loving the mask, not the real person underneath. That creates emptiness. And emptiness intensifies shadow behavior. People become addicted to validation because they secretly feel disconnected from themselves. They chase admiration externally while rejecting themselves internally. That inner contradiction creates suffering. The shadow grows strongest wherever honesty is absent. This is why radical self-honesty matters. Not self-hatred. Not shame. Honesty. The ability to admit, yes, I am insecure sometimes. Yes, I can be selfish. Yes, I crave validation. Yes, I fear abandonment. Yes, I have darkness within me. That honesty creates integration. And integration creates peace. Because once you stop fighting yourself internally, emotional energy returns. You no longer waste energy pretending to be perfect. You become authentic, grounded, human. And authentic people experience freedom differently. They no longer need constant external approval because they are no longer hiding from themselves. That is the real purpose of shadow work. Not becoming flawless, but becoming whole. Most people divide themselves psychologically into acceptable parts and unacceptable parts. But healing requires embracing your full humanity. The wounded parts, the angry parts, the vulnerable parts, the insecure parts. Not to become controlled by them, but to understand them consciously. Ignored darkness controls behavior unconsciously. Acknowledged darkness loses much of its power. That is why awareness transforms people. A conscious person may still feel jealousy, but they recognize it instead of becoming consumed by it. They may still feel anger, but they understand its roots instead of projecting it everywhere. They may still feel fear, but fear no longer secretly controls their entire identity. That is emotional evolution. Not the absence of darkness, but awareness of it. And eventually you realize something profound. The goal was never to become a perfect human being. The goal was to become an honest one. Because once you stop running from yourself, you stop needing to fight the world constantly. And perhaps the person you hated most was never only another person. Perhaps they were the reflection of a part of yourself you were finally being forced to confront. Chapter 8. Anger is often grief in armor. Not all anger is truly anger. Sometimes anger is sadness that no longer knows how to cry. Sometimes it is disappointment that hardened into bitterness. Sometimes it is grief wearing emotional armor because vulnerability feels too dangerous. Most people do not understand this. They think anger is strength, control, power, dominance. But beneath many angry people lives deep emotional pain. Pain they never processed. Pain they never expressed. Pain they never allowed themselves to feel honestly. Especially men. Many people are raised to suppress vulnerability from childhood. Stop crying. Be strong. Don't be weak. Man up. Slowly, emotional repression becomes identity. Sadness becomes shameful. Vulnerability becomes dangerous. Neediness becomes humiliating. So the mind searches for safer emotional expressions. And anger becomes the mask. Because anger feels powerful while grief feels exposed. Anger protects the ego from helplessness. A person abandoned by someone they loved may say, "I hate them." But beneath the hatred often lives heartbreak. A person constantly irritated by life may secretly feel emotionally exhausted. A person consumed by resentment may actually be mourning the version of life they lost. Many people are not angry. They are grieving. Grieving relationships. Grieving childhoods. Grieving identities. Grieving innocence. Grieving unmet emotional needs. But because grief feels vulnerable, the mind transforms it into rage. Rage feels easier than sadness. Sadness forces surrender. Anger creates the illusion of control. This is why emotionally wounded people often become defensive instantly. The anger protects hidden pain from exposure. A simple criticism can trigger explosive reactions because the nervous system interprets vulnerability as danger. Especially in people carrying unresolved emotional wounds. Their reactions seem excessive externally. But internally, old pain has been activated again. Pain from rejection. Pain from humiliation. Pain from abandonment. Pain from feeling unseen or unloved. Most emotional reactions are layered. What appears as anger on the surface often contains grief underneath, fear underneath, shame underneath, loneliness underneath, powerlessness underneath. But many people never dig beneath the surface emotion. They simply become identified with rage. And over time, anger becomes personality. The cynical person. The cold person. The constantly irritated person. The emotionally reactive person. Eventually they forget who they were before the pain hardened them. This is the danger of unprocessed grief. Unprocessed grief changes identity. A soft person becomes emotionally guarded. A trusting person becomes suspicious. A loving person becomes detached. Pain reshapes personality when it remains unresolved. That transformation happens slowly, almost invisibly. At first, the anger feels justified. And sometimes it is. People truly hurt you. Life truly disappoints you. But when anger becomes chronic, it begins poisoning the person carrying it. Resentment drains emotional energy constantly. The mind remains trapped in old emotional battles. Replay after replay. Argument after argument. Memory after memory. The nervous system never fully relaxes. That is why unresolved anger creates exhaustion. Your body carries what your mind refuses to release. And eventually emotional tension becomes physical tension. Sleep suffers. Focus suffers. Relationships suffer. Inner peace disappears. Still, many people cling to anger because anger gives them identity. If they let go of resentment, they fear their pain will become meaningless. So unconsciously they keep the wound alive. They replay betrayal repeatedly. Repeat the story repeatedly. Relive the injustice repeatedly. Because anger can create emotional purpose. The world hurt me. They ruined my life. I will never forgive them. This narrative protects the ego temporarily. But it also imprisons the soul. Because the longer resentment lives inside you, the longer the people who hurt you continue controlling your emotional state. Most people think holding on to anger protects them. Often it only prolongs suffering. That does not mean suppressing anger. Suppression is not healing. Suppressed emotions always return eventually. Sometimes through anxiety. Sometimes through depression. Sometimes through emotional numbness. Sometimes through physical illness. Healing requires feeling emotions honestly instead of becoming possessed by them. That includes grief. Real healing often begins the moment anger breaks open and sadness finally emerges. The tears finally come. The loneliness finally becomes acknowledged. The heartbreak finally becomes real. And beneath the rage, a wounded human being finally says, "I am hurt." That sentence is powerful. Because honesty ends emotional performance. Many people perform strength while silently falling apart internally. But vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is truth. And truth heals. Not instantly. But honestly. The problem is that vulnerability feels terrifying to wounded people. Especially those betrayed in the past. They fear that expressing pain will make them powerless. So they become emotionally armored. Detached. Cold. Guarded. But armor protects and isolates at the same time. A heavily armored person may avoid emotional pain. But they also block intimacy, connection, and peace. Eventually loneliness grows beneath the protection. That loneliness creates even more anger. This cycle repeats endlessly until awareness interrupts it. Until someone finally asks, "What is my anger protecting?" That question changes everything. Because anger usually protects something softer underneath. Fear of rejection. Fear of abandonment. Fear of humiliation. Fear of being unloved. Once you understand this, your relationship with emotions changes completely. You stop judging yourself for feeling deeply. You stop confusing emotional suppression with strength. You stop glorifying emotional numbness. Instead, you begin understanding that emotional maturity means feeling emotions without becoming controlled by them. That includes grief. Grief is not weakness. Grief is love with nowhere to go. Grief appears whenever something meaningful is lost. Not only people. Dreams. Identities. Childhood innocence. Versions of yourself. Humans grieve constantly throughout life. Most just never allow themselves to admit it. So the grief hardens into anger instead. But anger cannot heal grief. Only honesty can. Honesty about what hurt. What was lost. What was needed emotionally. What was never received. That honesty creates compassion. And compassion softens emotional armor. Not all at once. Slowly. You begin forgiving yourself for being human. For feeling deeply. For struggling. For carrying wounds you never fully understood before. And eventually you realize something important. The goal was never to become emotionless. The goal was to stop hiding from your emotions. Because hidden pain controls people unconsciously. Felt pain heals gradually. That is the difference. Many people spend their lives running from grief. But grief followed honestly eventually transforms into wisdom. It deepens empathy. Deepens self-awareness. Deepens emotional understanding. A person who truly processes pain often becomes softer, not harder. Stronger, not colder. More peaceful, not more defensive. Because they no longer need anger to protect wounds they finally allowed themselves to heal. And eventually you understand. Some of the angriest people in the world are simply the saddest people who never felt safe enough to cry. Chapter 9. Stop trying to win the emotional war. Not every battle is meant to be won. Some are meant to be released. But the ego hates release. The ego wants victory. It wants the apology. The explanation. The revenge. The final message. The emotional validation. It wants proof that your pain mattered. So the mind keeps fighting invisible wars long after the relationship, betrayal, or heartbreak has already ended. You replay arguments in your head. Imagine what you should have said. Fantasy about proving your worth someday. Emotionally, you remain trapped in combat. And the exhausting part is this. Most emotional wars have no winner. Only wounded people trying to protect their pride. One person wants to be understood. The other wants to avoid guilt. One wants closure. The other wants escape. Both are emotionally bleeding in different ways. But because humans fear vulnerability, they turn pain into conflict. That is why letting go feels so difficult. Letting go feels like surrender. And wounded egos confuse surrender with weakness. But emotional surrender is not defeat. It is acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never understand your pain. Some relationships cannot be repaired. Some apologies will never come. Some endings will never feel fair. Some wounds must heal without closure. This truth hurts deeply. Because humans crave emotional resolution. We want life to make sense. We want pain to feel justified. We want the people who hurt us to finally realize what they lost. But healing rarely arrives through external validation. It arrives through internal peace. And peace begins the moment you stop trying to emotionally win. Most people do not realize how much suffering comes from resistance. Resistance to reality. Resistance to endings. Resistance to change. Resistance to loss. The mind says, this should not have happened. They should not have treated me this way. This is unfair. And maybe it is unfair. But reality does not change because the mind rejects it emotionally. The more you resist reality, the more suffering expands. Acceptance is painful initially because acceptance ends illusion. It forces you to stop negotiating with the past. No more. Maybe if I said this differently. Maybe if I tried harder. Maybe if they change. Acceptance says, it happened. And emotionally, that can feel devastating. Because acceptance closes doors fantasy kept open. But fantasy traps people in emotional limbo. Reality frees them. Even painful reality. This is why emotionally mature people eventually stop chasing emotional control over situations they cannot change. They stop trying to force understanding, regret, reconciliation, emotional justice, because they realize something important. Peace is more valuable than emotional victory. Many people destroy their mental health trying to win emotionally. Win the breakup. Win the argument. Win the revenge. Win the validation. But even if they technically win, inner peace rarely follows. Why? Because external victory cannot heal internal wounds. You can make someone regret hurting you and still remain emotionally empty. You can receive an apology and still feel broken. You can prove your worth and still secretly hate yourself. The emotional war was never truly about the other person. It was about the unresolved relationship you had with yourself. That is why surrender becomes powerful. Not surrender to abuse. Not surrender to disrespect. Surrender to reality. The reality that some things are beyond your control. You cannot control who loves you, who leaves you, who understands you, who values you, who changes. You can only control your boundaries, your healing, your reactions, your choices, your relationship with yourself. That realization returns power to you. Because emotionally exhausted people are often trying to control things that were never theirs to control in the first place. And control is exhausting. Especially emotional control. Trying to manage someone else's perception of you. Trying to force emotional connection. Trying to prevent abandonment. Trying to avoid rejection. Humans spend enormous energy fighting uncertainty. But uncertainty is part of life. No relationship comes with guarantees. No human being can promise permanence. Trying to eliminate emotional risk completely only creates anxiety and attachment. Emotionally secure people understand this. They love fully, while accepting that nothing external is completely permanent. That awareness creates emotional freedom. Not because they care less, but because they stop trying to possess what was never fully theirs to own. Many people confuse love with ownership. If they love me, they should never leave. If I matter, they should always choose me. But humans are complex, fearful, wounded, confused, imperfect. Sometimes people leave because they are lost themselves. Sometimes they hurt others because they have never healed internally. Sometimes relationships end despite genuine love existing. Life is emotionally messy. And emotional maturity means accepting complexity without collapsing psychologically. That does not mean tolerating mistreatment. It means understanding that not every painful ending requires hatred. Sometimes two wounded people simply cannot heal each other. Sometimes attachment exists without compatibility. Sometimes love alone is not enough. These truths are difficult because fantasy taught most people otherwise. Movies taught eternal certainty. Reality teaches impermanence. Everything changes eventually. Relationships, identities, dreams, people, and fighting change only creates suffering. This is why emotionally peaceful people learn the art of release. Release does not mean forgetting. It means no longer emotionally gripping the wound every day. No longer needing the story to stay emotionally alive. No longer allowing pain to define identity. Many people unknowingly become emotionally addicted to struggle. The conflict becomes familiar. The heartbreak becomes identity. The resentment becomes purpose. Without the emotional war, they no longer know who they are. So unconsciously they keep fighting battles already over. But eventually exhaustion forces truth. You become tired of suffering. Tired of replaying. Tired of proving. Tired of carrying emotional weight that no longer serves your life. And slowly, Surrender begins naturally. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about your peace more than your pain. That is growth. The moment peace becomes more important than being right, more important than revenge, more important than winning emotionally. Most people never reach this stage because the ego fears emptiness after release. If I let go completely, what remains? At first, silence remains. Stillness remains. Grief remains. But eventually something deeper appears. Freedom. Freedom from obsession. Freedom from resentment. Freedom from emotional dependence. Freedom from needing another person to repair your inner world. That freedom changes the way you live. You stop chasing closure externally. You create closure internally. You stop waiting for apologies to heal. You heal because you deserve peace. You stop trying to prove your value to those incapable of recognizing it. You simply walk away with dignity. That is emotional power. Not domination. Not revenge. Not emotional manipulation. But inner stability. The ability to release what no longer aligns with your peace. Most people think strength means holding on. Sometimes strength means finally letting go. Letting go of fantasy. Letting go of resentment. Letting go of emotional dependency. Letting go of the need to be chosen by people who consistently fail to choose you. And eventually you realize something profound. The emotional war was never truly keeping you connected to the other person. It was keeping you disconnected from yourself. Because every moment spent fighting the past is a moment stolen from your present life. And life continues moving, whether you heal or not. So eventually a choice must be made. Continue fighting ghosts, or finally return your energy back to yourself. Chapter 10. Forgiveness is not for them. Most people misunderstand forgiveness. They think forgiveness means excusing what happened, pretending the pain did not matter, allowing someone back into their life, acting like betrayal was acceptable. So they resist it. They say they do not deserve forgiveness. And sometimes they are right. Some people never apologize, never change, never feel remorse, never truly understand the damage they caused. But forgiveness was never about protecting them. It was about freeing you. Because resentment is emotional imprisonment. The person who hurt you may move on with their life while your mind remains chained to the memory. Replay after replay. Anger after anger. Conversation after conversation. Emotionally, they continue occupying space inside you long after they are gone. That is the hidden cost of unresolved resentment. It steals presence, steals peace, steals emotional energy. Most people think holding on to anger keeps them strong. Often it keeps them emotionally attached. Because emotional attachment does not always look like love. Sometimes attachment looks like hatred, obsession, resentment, revenge fantasies, constant emotional replay. The mind remains connected to what it refuses to release. This is why forgiveness matters psychologically. Not as moral superiority, but as emotional liberation. Forgiveness says, I refuse to let this pain control my life forever. That is power, not weakness. Weakness is allowing old wounds to dominate your emotional world for years. Strength is feeling the pain honestly while refusing to become permanently defined by it. But forgiveness is difficult because pain changes people. Especially betrayal. Betrayal destroys innocence. It changes how people trust, how they love, how safe they feel emotionally. After deep emotional pain, many people become guarded. They promise themselves, never again. Never trust deeply again. Never love openly again. Never become vulnerable again. At first this feels protective. But emotional walls eventually become prisons. You may avoid future pain, but you also avoid intimacy, connection, and emotional freedom. That is the tragedy of unresolved hurt. The people who hurt you indirectly shape the person you become afterward. Unless awareness interrupts the cycle. This is where forgiveness becomes transformational. Not because the past changes, but because you change your relationship to it. You stop feeding the wound constantly. You stop replaying betrayal as identity. You stop defining your future through your past pain. That does not mean forgetting. Some scars remain forever. But scars do not need to remain emotionally infected. Healing means the memory exists without controlling your nervous system constantly. You remember, without emotionally reliving the wound every day. That is freedom. Most people secretly wait for something external before allowing themselves peace. An apology, justice, regret, karma. They think, once they suffer the way I suffered, then I can move on. But this mindset keeps your peace dependent on another person's behavior. That is emotional slavery. Your healing cannot depend entirely on someone else becoming emotionally aware. Some people never will. Some people lack the emotional depth to fully understand the damage they caused. Others understand, and still do not care. This reality hurts. But accepting it creates maturity. Because eventually you realize, closure is not always given. Sometimes it is created. Internally. Through acceptance. Through understanding. Through release. Many people avoid forgiveness because they fear it invalidates their pain. But true forgiveness fully acknowledges pain. It says, yes, this hurt me deeply. Yes, this changed me. Yes, this was unfair. But I refuse to carry this poison forever. That is wisdom. Because resentment poisons the person carrying it more than the person who caused it. Anger kept alive too long becomes identity. People become emotionally bitter, suspicious, cynical, unable to trust, unable to soften. The wound becomes their entire personality. And eventually they stop living fully because emotionally they never left the moment they were hurt. Forgiveness restores movement. It allows emotional life to continue. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But gradually. This process often begins with self-forgiveness. Because beneath resentment toward others often lives hidden resentment toward yourself. You blame yourself for ignoring red flags, staying too long, trusting too deeply, abandoning your boundaries, loving someone who hurt you. That self-blame becomes internal punishment. And many people secretly suffer more from self-hatred than from the original betrayal itself. This is why self-forgiveness matters deeply. You were human. Human beings hope, trust, attach, love imperfectly. Sometimes wounded people make painful choices because they are emotionally hungry for connection. That does not make you weak. It makes you human. Self-forgiveness says, I did the best I could with the awareness I had at that time. That sentence softens shame. And healing cannot grow where shame dominates. People trapped in shame remain emotionally frozen. They replay mistakes endlessly. Punish themselves endlessly. But punishment is not transformation. Awareness transforms. Learning transforms. Growth transforms. And growth requires compassion. Not denial. Not excuses. Compassion. The kind that allows you to face your past honestly without destroying yourself psychologically. This balance matters. Too much blame creates shame. Too little accountability prevents growth. Healing exists between those extremes. You acknowledge reality honestly while still treating yourself with humanity. That is emotional maturity. Many people believe forgiveness is a single moment. Usually it is a process. Some days you feel peace. Other days old anger returns unexpectedly. That does not mean healing failed. It means emotional wounds heal gradually. Layer by layer. Memory by memory. Trigger by trigger. Eventually the emotional charge weakens. The obsession weakens. The resentment weakens. And one day you realize you are no longer emotionally living inside the wound. You have returned to yourself. That is the true purpose of forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Not pretending. Not forgetting. Freedom. Freedom from carrying emotional weight that no longer deserves control over your life. And perhaps the deepest form of forgiveness is this: accepting that painful experiences can become wisdom instead of lifelong prisons. Because some people were never meant to stay forever. Some entered your life to teach boundaries. Teach self-respect. Teach emotional awareness. Teach you what happens when you abandon yourself for attachment. Painful teachers still teach valuable lessons. And once the lesson is learned, resentment becomes unnecessary. Not because the pain was acceptable, but because your suffering no longer needs to continue. Eventually you understand something powerful. Forgiveness does not mean they deserved your grace. It means you finally decided your peace deserved a future. Chapter 11. Rebuilding self-respect. Self-respect is not confidence. Confidence is how you feel about your abilities. Self-respect is how you allow yourself to be treated. And many people lose themselves not because they lacked confidence, but because they abandoned self-respect in exchange for connection. They tolerated what hurt them, ignored what dishonored them, accepted less than they truly needed emotionally. Not because they were weak, because they were afraid. Afraid of loneliness. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of losing someone they emotionally depended on. Fear makes people betray themselves quietly. At first, the compromises seem small. You ignore one disrespectful comment. Then another. You silence your feelings to avoid conflict. You accept inconsistency because you fear losing attention completely. You lower standards hoping love will eventually become stable. And slowly, something dangerous happens. You begin teaching people how little you value yourself. That is the painful truth about boundaries. People often treat you according to what you repeatedly tolerate. This does not excuse mistreatment. But tolerance communicates permission. Every time you abandon your emotional truth to keep someone comfortable, self-respect weakens internally. And the body feels it, even if the mind tries to deny it. That is why people in unhealthy relationships often feel emotionally exhausted. Their soul knows something their attachment refuses to admit. You cannot build peace while constantly betraying your own needs. Eventually resentment appears. Not only toward the other person, but toward yourself. Because deep down, you know you are participating in your own emotional erosion. That realization hurts. Especially for people who spent their lives earning love through sacrifice. Many humans were conditioned from childhood to believe love must be earned. Earned through pleasing others, overgiving, staying quiet, tolerating pain, proving loyalty, abandoning personal needs. So they grow into adults who confuse self-neglect with love. They become caretakers of everyone except themselves. And because they fear rejection deeply, they struggle to say no. No feels dangerous. No risks abandonment. So they say yes when they mean no. Smile when they feel hurt. Stay when they want to leave. Give when they feel empty. This pattern destroys self-respect slowly. Because every ignored boundary sends the same message internally. My feelings matter less than keeping this connection. Over time, this creates emotional emptiness. You become disconnected from yourself. Disconnected from your intuition. Disconnected from your needs. Disconnected from your identity. Eventually you no longer know who you truly are outside pleasing others. That is why rebuilding self-respect changes everything. Because self-respect reconnects you to yourself. It teaches your nervous system, my emotions matter too. For many people, this feels unfamiliar. Even uncomfortable. Especially those raised in emotionally unhealthy environments. People accustomed to self-abandonment often feel guilty when they finally prioritize themselves. Setting boundaries feels selfish. Speaking honestly feels rude. Walking away feels cruel. But boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are self-protection. And self-protection is necessary for emotional health. A person without boundaries becomes emotionally consumed by other people's behavior constantly. Their peace depends entirely on external treatment. One text changes their mood. One rejection destroys their self-worth. One disagreement creates emotional collapse. Why? Because without boundaries, identity becomes emotionally dependent on others. That dependence creates suffering. Self-respect breaks that cycle. It teaches you that your value is not determined by who stays, who leaves, who chooses you, who validates you, who understands you. Your value exists independently of external approval. That realization creates inner stability. And stable people move differently through life. They still love deeply. But they no longer beg. No longer chase endlessly. No longer sacrifice dignity for temporary attention. Because once self-respect grows, desperation weakens. You stop tolerating emotional inconsistency just because you fear being alone. You stop explaining your worth to people determined not to see it. You stop trying to earn basic respect. That is emotional maturity. Understanding that love without respect eventually becomes suffering. Many people stay emotionally attached long after relationships become destructive because attachment feels stronger than self-worth. But attachment without self-respect creates emotional slavery. You become willing to tolerate anything to avoid abandonment. Disrespect. Manipulation. Dishonesty. Neglect. Your standards disappear because fear controls your decisions. This is why healing loneliness matters. Lonely people often accept emotional crumbs because emptiness feels unbearable. But emotional starvation should not force self-betrayal. Temporary loneliness is healthier than permanent self-abandonment. That sentence changes lives once truly understood. Because many people fear solitude more than suffering. So they remain in emotionally draining relationships simply to avoid facing themselves alone. But solitude can heal. Silence can heal. Being alone teaches you something attachment never can. You can survive your own company. That realization rebuilds inner strength. Slowly, your relationship with yourself changes. You begin listening to your intuition again. Honoring discomfort instead of suppressing it. Leaving situations that repeatedly destroy your peace. Protecting your emotional energy instead of giving it endlessly to people who drain it. This process often feels lonely initially. Because people accustomed to benefiting from your lack of boundaries may resist your growth. Some will call you selfish, cold, different, difficult. But growth always changes relationships. Especially relationships built around your self-sacrifice. Not everyone will celebrate your healing. Some people preferred the version of you that abandoned themselves for others. That truth is painful. But necessary. Because self-respect sometimes requires disappointing people who benefited from your lack of it. This is where courage becomes necessary. The courage to lose connection rather than lose yourself. Emotionally mature people understand this deeply. They know that protecting inner peace sometimes requires walking away. Not with hatred. Not with revenge. But with clarity. The clarity that no relationship is worth permanent damage to your emotional well-being. Many people think self-respect means arrogance. It does not. Arrogance says, I am better than others. Self-respect says, I will not abandon myself to keep others comfortable. There is a huge difference. Self-respect is quiet, calm, grounded. It does not need to prove superiority. It simply refuses humiliation, refuses emotional self-destruction, refuses relationships that consistently violate dignity. And once this mindset develops, life changes dramatically. You become less emotionally reactive, less desperate for validation, less terrified of rejection, because your worth no longer depends entirely on external acceptance. You begin choosing relationships from alignment instead of emotional hunger. That changes everything. Because emotionally hungry people often choose connection based on fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being unwanted. Fear of not being enough. But emotionally healthy people choose from self-awareness. They ask, does this relationship protect my peace? Can I be authentic here? Do I feel emotionally safe? Am I respected consistently? These questions prevent enormous suffering. Because love alone is never enough. Without respect, love becomes unstable. Without boundaries, love becomes draining. Without honesty, love becomes manipulation. Real love supports self-respect. It does not require self-destruction. And perhaps the most important transformation happens here. You stop trying to convince people to value you. That need disappears gradually. Because finally, you value yourself enough to walk away from what continuously damages your spirit. That is freedom. Not becoming cold. Not refusing love. But refusing to lose yourself inside it. And eventually you realize something powerful. The moment you stopped abandoning yourself was the moment your healing truly began. Chapter 12. Becoming untouchable. Most people misunderstand what it means to become untouchable. They imagine someone cold, emotionless, detached from humanity, unaffected by pain. But true emotional strength is not emotional numbness. It is emotional stability. The ability to feel deeply without falling apart completely. The ability to experience pain without becoming controlled by it. The ability to love without losing yourself. That is what makes a person truly untouchable. Not arrogance. Not avoidance. Not pretending nothing hurts. Real emotional power is quiet. Calm under pressure. Grounded during chaos. Clear even in emotional storms. Most people spend their lives reacting impulsively to everything around them. A message changes their mood. A rejection destroys their confidence. An insult ruins their day. Someone leaving makes them question their worth. Their inner world depends entirely on external circumstances. That is emotional dependence. And emotional dependence gives the world enormous power over you. Becoming untouchable means reclaiming that power. It means understanding that your peace cannot remain permanently tied to other people's opinions, temporary relationships, external validation, emotional attention, constant reassurance. Because anything external can disappear. And if your identity collapses every time life changes, suffering becomes endless. Emotionally untouchable people understand impermanence. They understand. People change. Relationships end. Life becomes unpredictable. Pain is unavoidable. But instead of resisting reality constantly, they develop inner stability strong enough to survive it. That changes everything. Because once stability comes from within, fear begins weakening. Fear of rejection weakens. Fear of abandonment weakens. Fear of loneliness weakens. Not because pain disappears, but because you finally trust yourself enough to survive it. That self-trust creates calmness. Many people spend years trying to become emotionally invulnerable. But invulnerability is impossible. Humans are emotional beings. Loss hurts. Rejection hurts. Grief hurts. The goal is not to eliminate emotion. The goal is to stop becoming psychologically destroyed by every painful experience. That requires emotional discipline. Discipline over attention. Discipline over reaction. Discipline over thought patterns. Most suffering becomes amplified because the mind continuously feeds emotional wounds. Replay after replay. Story after story. Meaning after meaning. A painful event happens once. The mind relives it thousands of times. Emotionally untouchable people interrupt this cycle consciously. They feel emotions honestly, without feeding emotional chaos endlessly. That is mastery, not suppression. Awareness. The ability to observe thoughts without immediately believing them. Observe emotions without becoming consumed by them. This awareness creates inner space. And within that space, peace becomes possible. Many people are trapped because they identify completely with their emotions. I feel rejected, therefore I am worthless. I feel abandoned, therefore I am unlovable. I feel anxious, therefore something terrible will happen. Emotionally mature people think differently. They understand emotions are temporary experiences, not permanent identity. This changes the nervous system completely. Because once emotions stop defining your self-worth, emotional resilience grows naturally. You stop panicking every time discomfort appears. You stop catastrophizing every rejection. You stop attaching identity to temporary emotional states. That creates freedom. Freedom from emotional chaos. Freedom from compulsive attachment. Freedom from needing constant external reassurance to feel okay internally. Most people search for security in relationships. But relationships alone cannot create permanent security. Real security is internal. The knowledge that, no matter what happens externally, I will not abandon myself. That mindset changes the way you love. You stop loving from fear. You stop clinging desperately. You stop tolerating disrespect just to avoid loneliness. Because now your peace matters more than temporary attachment. That is emotional evolution. You begin choosing relationships that align with your nervous system instead of relationships that stimulate your wounds. That distinction matters deeply. Wounded people are often attracted to emotional intensity. Healthy people are attracted to emotional consistency. This changes everything. Chaos stops feeling romantic. Unpredictability stops feeling exciting. Emotional games stop feeling attractive. Peace becomes attractive. Honesty becomes attractive. Stability becomes attractive. Because once the nervous system heals, suffering no longer feels like love. That transformation is profound. It changes your standards, your boundaries, your decisions, your entire relationship with yourself. You stop chasing emotionally unavailable people hoping to finally feel chosen. You stop needing to prove your worth constantly. You stop sacrificing your mental health for emotional attachment. Instead, you become selective with your energy, protective of your peace, aware of your emotional patterns. That awareness prevents enormous suffering. Because emotionally untouchable people recognize red flags early. Not because they are cynical, but because they no longer ignore their intuition to maintain connection. That is wisdom earned through pain. Pain teaches clearly when fully understood. Most people waste pain. They suffer without learning. Repeat the same emotional cycles. Ignore the same lessons. Choose the same destructive patterns. But conscious people transform pain into awareness. And awareness transforms their entire life. Eventually something shifts internally. You stop needing revenge. Stop needing closure. Stop needing everyone to understand your pain. Because inner peace becomes more important than emotional drama. That calmness confuses many people. Especially those addicted to emotional chaos. They mistake peace for weakness. But peace requires enormous strength. Anyone can react impulsively. Few people can remain grounded during emotional storms. That is mastery. The ability to stay connected to yourself even when life becomes painful. Many people lose themselves during suffering. Emotionally untouchable people deepen their connection to themselves through suffering. That is the difference. Pain no longer destroys them. It refines them, makes them wiser, more compassionate, more disciplined, more self-aware. Eventually they stop fearing life so intensely. Because they realize something important. They have already survived pain before. And they can survive it again. That confidence creates fearlessness. Not fearlessness because nothing bad can happen. But fearlessness because they trust their ability to handle reality honestly. This trust removes desperation. And desperation is what destroys emotional peace most. Desperate people cling, beg, chase, manipulate, overthink. Emotionally stable people do not need to force life constantly. They trust themselves enough to release what does not align with their well-being. That is power. Quiet power. The kind that does not need validation to exist. Eventually you stop asking, how do I avoid pain forever? And start asking, how do I remain connected to myself no matter what happens? That question changes your entire life. Because true emotional strength was never about controlling the world. It was about mastering your relationship with yourself. And once you master that relationship, very little in this world can truly break you anymore. Conclusion. You were never broken. For most of your life, you probably believed your pain meant something was wrong with you. That your anger made you toxic. Your sadness made you weak. Your attachment made you needy. Your overthinking made you damaged. But pain was never proof that you were broken. Pain was proof that something inside you needed attention. Needed honesty. Needed healing. Every chapter of your suffering was trying to show you something. Where you abandoned yourself. Where fear controlled your decisions. Where validation replaced self-worth. Where unresolved wounds shaped your relationships. Where attachment became stronger than self-respect. Your anger was not random. Your heartbreak was not meaningless. Your emotional chaos was not weakness. It was communication. Your mind and body were trying to tell you what your conscious self kept ignoring. That is why healing begins with awareness. Not blame. Not shame. Awareness. The moment you stop asking, what is wrong with me? And start asking, what happened to me emotionally? Everything begins changing. Because wounded people often spend years punishing themselves for survival mechanisms they developed unconsciously. The people pleaser learns survival through approval. The emotionally distant person learns survival through detachment. The anxious person learns survival through hypervigilance. The perfectionist learns survival through control. These patterns were never signs of worthlessness. They were adaptations. But survival is not the same as living. Eventually survival patterns begin destroying peace. And life forces transformation. Usually through pain. Pain interrupts illusion. It forces self-reflection. It exposes hidden wounds. It reveals the emotional patterns running your life unconsciously. And if you are willing to face yourself honestly, pain can become the beginning of awakening instead of permanent destruction. That is the choice every wounded person eventually faces. Remain identified with the wound. Or grow beyond it. Many people never leave their pain psychologically. They build identity around suffering. The betrayed person. The abandoned person. The angry person. The broken person. But wounds are experiences. Not identity. You are not the worst thing that happened to you. You are not your heartbreak. Not your trauma. Not your rejection. Not your mistakes. Those experiences shaped you. but they do not define the entirety of your existence. Healing begins the moment you stop worshiping pain as identity. Because the truth is, you were never meant to stay emotionally trapped in the past forever. You were meant to learn, to evolve, to awaken, to become conscious. That is the hidden gift inside suffering. Not the pain itself, but the awareness it can create. Awareness of your boundaries, your emotional patterns, your unconscious fears, your need for validation, your relationship with yourself. Once awareness appears, transformation becomes possible. And transformation changes everything. You begin loving differently. Not from desperation, but from wholeness. You stop chasing people who repeatedly drain your spirit. You stop abandoning your needs for temporary attention. You stop confusing emotional intensity with genuine love. You stop needing everyone to choose you in order to feel valuable. Because finally, you choose yourself. That is where peace begins. Not when life becomes perfect. Not when everyone understands you. Not when pain disappears forever. Peace begins when your relationship with yourself becomes stronger than your fear of loneliness. That changes how you move through the world. You become calmer, more grounded, more honest. You stop fighting reality constantly. You stop needing control over every outcome. You stop carrying emotional wars long after they ended. Instead, you learn the art of release. Release of resentment. Release of obsession. Release of emotional dependency. Release of old identities built around suffering. And in that release, something beautiful happens. You return to yourself. The version of you buried beneath fear, attachment, shame, and emotional survival. The version that existed before pain hardened you. Not naive. Not weak. But aware. Stronger because of what you survived. Wiser because of what you lost. More compassionate because of what you felt deeply. That is real healing. Not becoming emotionless. Not pretending nothing hurt. But becoming emotionally free enough that pain no longer controls your entire identity. And perhaps this is the most important truth of all. You were never angry only at them. You were angry at every moment you abandoned yourself trying to keep love, approval, or connection alive. But now you see clearly. And awareness changes everything. Because once you stop betraying yourself, your entire life begins changing from the inside out. The healing was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you were before the world taught you to abandon yourself.